Welcome to the Whispered Ages. This episode is about medieval guilds. We appreciate your support for this channel. Please consider liking and subscribing. Now on with the episode. Imagine, if you will, a medieval town in the hour before sunrise. The cobblestones are still wet with dew, and the sky above the crooked rooftops holds that peculiar blue that belongs only to the space between night and day. A cockerel cries somewhere beyond the town walls. Then, gradually, the settlement begins to stir. A shutter creaks open, a door swings wide, and from the narrow streets and cramped workshops, the sounds of labor begin to rise like a slow tide. First comes the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, striking iron while it still holds the memory of the forge's heat. Then the softer sounds, the whisper of a weaver's shuttle passing through threads, the scrape of a baker's wooden paddle against the oven floor, the gentle tap of a cobbler's all-piercing leather. Each sound carries its own signature, its own story, its own place in the great symphony of medieval urban life. Above the doorways of these workshops hang painted signs, swaying gently in the morning breeze. A golden key marks the locksmith, a white swan identifies the tavern, a pair of scissors, freshly painted in red and silver, announces the tailor. These symbols speak to a population where reading remains a rare skill, but everyone understands the language of craft. They announce not merely what is sold within, but who belongs to whom, which families have practiced which trades for generations, which streets and neighborhoods have become synonymous with particular skills. This is the world of the medieval guild, and it is far more complex, more human, and more consequential than we might first imagine. When we speak of guilds today, the word often conjures images of dusty regulations and monopolistic practices, of old men in robes jealously guarding trade secrets. There is some truth in this picture, as there is in most caricatures, but it captures only a fragment of what these institutions truly were. A guild was not merely a trade organization, it was a family of sorts, a mutual aid society, a religious brotherhood, a political force, and for many medieval people, the very framework through which they understood their place in the world. To comprehend the guild is to comprehend medieval urban life itself. The two cannot be separated. When a young boy of 7 or 8 years left his parents' home to begin an apprenticeship, he was not simply learning a trade. He was entering a new household, gaining new parents in the form of his master and mistress, and beginning a journey that would shape his entire identity. When a master craftsman paid his guild dues and attended the quarterly meetings, he was not merely fulfilling a bureaucratic obligation. He was participating in a community that would bury him when he died, care for his widow after his death, and ensure his children did not starve. The guild hall itself stood as a physical manifestation of this collective identity. In prosperous towns, these buildings rivaled churches in their grandeur. The Cloth Hall of Ypres, before its destruction in the Great War, stretched for over 130 meters, its belfry rising 70 meters into the Flemish sky. The guild halls of Brussels and Antwerp displayed ornate facades that proclaimed the wealth and pride of their members. Even in smaller towns, the guild halls served as a gathering place, a court, a treasury, and a symbol of everything the guild represented. Within these halls, decisions were made that affected every aspect of a craftsman's life. Here, prices were set, quality standards established, disputes arbitrated, and new members welcomed into the fold. Here, too, were the great feasts held, the celebrations that marked the turning of the year and the honoring of patron saints. The smell of roasted meat and spiced wine would fill these chambers on feast days, and the sound of laughter and song would spill out into the streets, reminding everyone that the guild was not merely an institution but a living community. The guild's reach extended even into the spiritual realm. Most guilds maintained their own chapel or altar within the town church, dedicated to their patron saint. The bakers honored Saint Elizabeth. The blacksmiths venerated Saint Eligius, himself a skilled metalworker, before becoming a bishop. The weavers gathered before the image of Saint Blaise, whose iron combs had become instruments of his martyrdom, and thus symbols of their trade. These dedications were not mere formalities. Guild members attended Mass together, prayed together, and believed that their patron saint watched over their work and interceded for their souls. And so, as we begin this journey through the world of medieval guilds, we must set aside our modern assumptions about the separation of economic life from social life, of work from worship, of individual ambition from collective belonging. The medieval guild knew no such divisions. It was all of these things at once, woven together like the threads on a weaver's loom, creating a fabric that clothed an entire civilization. The towns themselves were still young in the centuries when guilds first emerged. In the year 1000, much of Europe remained overwhelmingly rural, its population scattered across manors and villages, bound to the land and to the lords who claimed dominion over it. Towns existed, certainly remnants of Roman settlements, cathedral cities, fortified burghs clustered around castles, but they were small, often numbering only a few hundred souls, and their economic life remained limited. Yet change was stirring. The great invasions that had plagued Europe for centuries, Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, Saracens from the south, were gradually subsiding. The climate was warming, allowing more land to be cultivated and more mouths to be fed. Population began to grow, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, and as it grew, so too did the need for goods that could not be produced on every manor iron tools, finished cloth, leather goods, the thousand small necessities of daily life. Trade routes that had fallen silent began to hum again with activity. The great fairs of Champagne drew merchants from Italy and Flanders, from England and the German lands. Venice and Genoa built fleets that connected the Mediterranean world. The Hanseatic towns of the Baltic created networks that stretched from Novgorod to London, and wherever trade flowed, towns grew up to serve it. Market towns, port towns, towns clustered at river crossings and mountain passes, each one a small center of exchange in an increasingly connected world. It was in this context of growth and change that the guild system took shape. The process was gradual, organic, and varied enormously from place to place. There was no single moment when guilds were invented, no founding document that established their principles. Rather, they emerged from the accumulated needs and practices of people trying to make their way in a rapidly changing world. The earliest forms of guild-like organization drew on ancient precedents. The Roman Empire had known collegia, associations of craftsmen and merchants that combined trade functions with religious and social purposes. Some of these may have survived in attenuated form through the early medieval centuries, particularly in Italy, where urban life never entirely disappeared. But the guilds of the High Middle Ages were not simply continuations of Roman institutions. They were new creations, shaped by new circumstances. In the earliest phase, it was merchants, rather than craftsmen, who led the way. Men who traded across long distances faced particular challenges. They traveled through territories where they had no legal standing, where local lords might seize their goods on any pretext, where disputes had no easy resolution. Banding together offered protection. A group of merchants could negotiate collectively with lords and towns, securing privileges and safe conducts that no individual trader could obtain. They could pool resources to build ships or hire guards. They could establish warehouses and counting houses in foreign cities, creating networks of trust that made long-distance trade possible. These merchant associations often began informally, as groups of traders who knew and trusted one another, who drank together at the same tavern, who worshipped at the same church. Gradually, they became more structured, adopting written rules, electing officers, collecting dues, and maintaining common funds. By the 11th and 12th centuries, formal merchant guilds had appeared across much of Europe. The guild merchant of English towns, the Hansa of German trading cities, the arti of Italian communes. The craft guilds followed somewhat later, though the timing varied considerably. In some places, craftsmen organized themselves within the framework of existing merchant guilds. In others, they formed their own associations from the beginning. In still others, they remained unorganized for centuries, their trades controlled by individual masters without collective structure. What drove craftsmen to organize was partly the example of the merchants, but also their own particular needs. A blacksmith, working alone, had little power to influence the price of his goods or the conditions of his trade. But a group of blacksmiths, acting together, could establish standards that protected all of them. They could ensure that no one undercut prices to the detriment of the whole trade. They could prevent unqualified workers from flooding the market with shoddy goods. They could negotiate with town authorities for favorable regulations and with merchants for fair treatment. There was also a defensive aspect to guild formation. As towns grew more prosperous, they attracted newcomers, journeymen from other regions, rural workers seeking urban opportunities, immigrants from distant lands, established craftsmen who had invested years in learning their trades and building their reputations, naturally sought to protect their positions against this influx. The guild provided a mechanism for controlling entry into the trade, for distinguishing insiders from outsiders, for preserving the privileges that established masters had worked so hard to obtain. The towns themselves often encouraged guild formation, seeing in these organizations useful instruments of order and control. A guild could be held collectively responsible for the quality of goods produced by its members, ensuring that the town's reputation for fine cloth or well-forged iron would be maintained. A guild could collect taxes from its members more efficiently than the town could collect them from individuals. A guild could police its own members, settling disputes and punishing infractions without burdening the town's limited judicial resources. And so, through the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, guilds proliferated across Europe. Paris alone would eventually count more than 100 distinct craft guilds, each with its own regulations, its own hierarchy, its own traditions. London, Florence, Bruges, Cologne, Barcelona, every significant town developed its own constellation of guilds, reflecting the particular mix of trades that flourished within its walls. The guild had become the fundamental unit of economic organization in medieval urban life. The merchant guilds, being the earliest and often the wealthiest, occupied a special place in the medieval urban landscape. These were not associations of small traders haggling over vegetables in the market square. They were organizations of substantial men who dealt in wool by the shipload and cloth by the cartload, who maintained agents in distant cities and extended credit across kingdoms, who dressed in fine fabrics and lived in stone houses and sat in the front pews of the town church. The power of merchant guilds derived from their control over long-distance trade, which in the medieval economy was the source of the greatest profits. A local craftsman might earn a comfortable living making shoes or barrels, but he would never grow truly wealthy. The merchant who bought wool in England, shipped it to Flanders, had it woven into cloth, and sold the cloth in the fairs of Champagne, could multiply his capital many times over. And the guild that controlled access to such trade routes controlled the lifeblood of urban prosperity. In many towns, particularly in the earlier centuries of guild development, the merchant guild effectively governed the town itself. The guild's officers were the town's officers. The guild's hall was the town hall. The guild's regulations were the town's laws, at least in matters of trade and commerce. This fusion of guild and municipal authority was especially pronounced in England, where the guild merchant often served as the primary vehicle through which towns exercised their chartered rights. Consider the guild merchant of a typical English borough in the 12th century. Its members enjoyed the exclusive right to trade within the town without paying tolls, a privilege of enormous value, when tolls and customs duties could eat deeply into a merchant's profits. Non-members, by contrast, faced significant disadvantages. They might be required to sell their goods only to guild members at prices the guild determined. They might be forbidden from retailing goods directly to consumers. They might be subjected to special taxes and restrictions that made profitable trade nearly impossible. The guild merchant also regulated the conduct of its members, ensuring fair dealing and preventing practices that might damage the collective reputation. Members who sold adulterated goods, who cheated customers with false weights, or who violated the guild's pricing agreements faced fines, suspension, or expulsion. The guild court heard disputes between members and outsiders, providing a form of commercial justice that was often swifter and more expert than anything the royal courts could offer. Beyond these economic functions, the merchant guild served as a social institution of the first importance. Membership conferred status and respectability. The guild's feasts and ceremonies provided occasions for display and fellowship. The guild's charitable activities supporting poor members, caring for the sick, burying the dead created bonds of mutual obligation that extended beyond mere business relationships. The Guildhall itself became a center of social life. Here merchants gathered to discuss prices and markets, to share news from distant lands, to negotiate partnerships and settle accounts. Here too they entertained visiting traders, impressing them with the town's prosperity and hospitality. The great guild halls of Flanders and the Low Countries, with their soaring towers and ornate facades, proclaimed to all the world the wealth and power of the merchant class. Yet the dominance of merchant guilds was never absolute, and over time it was increasingly challenged. As craft production grew more sophisticated and more valuable, craftsmen began to demand a greater voice in town affairs. Why should weavers, whose skill and labor created the cloth that merchants sold, have no say in how the cloth trade was regulated? Why should tanners and dyers, without whose work the leather and fabric trades could not exist, be excluded from the councils where decisions were made? These tensions played out differently, in different places. In some towns, craft guilds gradually won representation in town government, creating systems where both merchants and craftsmen shared power. In others, violent conflicts erupted as craftsmen sought to overthrow merchant oligarchies. The famous revolt of the Ciompi in Florence in 1378 saw woolworkers briefly seize control of the city government, though their triumph proved short-lived. In the Flemish towns, similar struggles convulsed urban life throughout the 14th century. The outcome of these conflicts shaped the political character of medieval towns for generations. Some became oligarchies dominated by wealthy merchant families, their guild structures serving mainly to perpetuate existing hierarchies. Others developed more participatory systems, with craft guilds playing significant roles in municipal governance. Still others saw continuing struggles, with power shifting back and forth between different factions and interests. Through all these variations, however, the merchant guild remained a central institution. Even where craft guilds gained political power, merchants retained their economic importance. The goods that craftsmen produced still needed to be sold, and selling them across long distances remained the province of specialized traders with capital, connections, and expertise. The merchant guild might share power, but it never lost its place in the medieval urban order. Meanwhile, in the workshops and forges and bakeries of the medieval town, the craft guilds were creating their own distinctive world. If the merchant guilds dealt in the grand sweep of commerce, the craft guilds concerned themselves with the intimate details of production, the quality of materials, the techniques of manufacture, the training of workers, the standards that distinguished good work from bad. Each craft had its own character, its own rhythms, its own culture. The goldsmith's workshop was a place of quiet precision, where tiny hammers tapped delicate patterns into precious metal and keen eyes examined work through magnifying lenses. The blacksmith's forge was a realm of fire and force, where heavy hammers rang against anvils and sparks flew like stars in the smoky darkness. The weaver's loom created a world of rhythm and repetition, the shuttle flying back and forth, the treadles rising and falling, the cloth growing thread by thread. The guild structure reflected these differences. Some crafts required little capital and could be practiced by almost anyone with basic skills: bakers, cobblers, tailors. Their guilds tended to be relatively open, with modest entry fees and straightforward requirements for membership. Other crafts demanded substantial investment in tools and materials: goldsmiths, armorers, bell founders. Their guilds were more exclusive, their entry requirements more demanding, their membership more limited. The regulations that craft guilds developed were extraordinarily detailed, reflecting centuries of accumulated experience and hard-won wisdom. A weaver's guild might specify the exact number of threads per inch that constituted acceptable cloth, the precise dimensions of a standard bolt, the dyes that could be used and those that were forbidden. A baker's guild might regulate the weight of a standard loaf, the quality of flour that could be used, the hours during which ovens could be fired. A goldsmith's guild might establish standards of purity for different grades of work, require that all pieces be marked with the maker's stamp, and mandate inspections at every stage of production. These regulations served multiple purposes. Most obviously, they protected consumers from fraud and shoddy workmanship. A buyer who purchased cloth bearing the guild's seal could trust that it met established standards. A customer who commissioned a piece of silver plate could be confident that it contained the promised proportion of precious metal. In an age before consumer protection laws and regulatory agencies, the guild's guarantee of quality served an essential function. But the regulations also protected guild members themselves. By establishing minimum standards, they prevented a race to the bottom in which unscrupulous craftsmen might undercut honest ones by producing inferior goods at lower prices. By controlling entry into the trade, they limited competition and maintained the value of guild membership. By prohibiting night work and regulating working hours, they prevented the exploitation of workers and ensured that no master could gain unfair advantage through excessive labor. The guild's quality control extended to the raw materials that craftsmen used. Wool merchants who supplied weavers might be required to submit their goods for inspection before sale. Tanners who prepared leather for cobblers and saddlers faced similar scrutiny. The guild sought to control the entire chain of production, ensuring quality at every stage. Enforcement of these regulations fell to guild officials, typically elected from among the masters. These wardens or searchers had the right to enter any workshop, examine any goods, and impose fines or other penalties for violations. In serious cases, they might seize defective merchandise, publicly burn it in the market square, and expel the offending craftsman from the guild. The shame of such public punishment served as a powerful deterrent. The craft guild also served as a vehicle for preserving and transmitting the accumulated knowledge of the trade. In an age before technical manuals and engineering schools, skills passed from master to apprentice through years of hands-on training. The guild system institutionalized this process, ensuring that the secrets of each craft would be preserved and passed on to future generations. Some of these secrets were genuinely valuable techniques for achieving particular effects, knowledge of materials and their properties, tricks of the trade that made difficult tasks easier. The Venetian glassmakers of Murano, for example, guarded their techniques so jealously that craftsmen who attempted to leave the island and practice their trade elsewhere faced severe penalties, even death. The secret of their cristallo glass, clear as rock crystal, brought enormous wealth to Venice and was protected accordingly. Other secrets were more modest but no less important to those who possessed them. A dyer might know which local plants produced the most color-fast hues. A blacksmith might understand how to temper steel for particular purposes. A baker might have perfected a technique for achieving a particular texture of crust. These small advantages, accumulated over generations, gave established craftsmen an edge that newcomers could not easily match. The physical organization of medieval towns often reflected the guild structure. Craftsmen of the same trade tended to cluster together, creating streets and neighborhoods associated with particular occupations. The street names that survive in many European cities bear witness to this pattern. Bread Street and Milk Street in London, the Rue des Bouchers in Brussels, the Calzaioli in Florence. This clustering was partly practical, allowing craftsmen to share resources and customers to find what they needed easily. But it also reinforced guild solidarity, creating communities within communities where masters knew their neighbors and could easily monitor compliance with guild regulations. Within each workshop, a particular hierarchy prevailed, one that would shape the lives of all who entered the craft. At the apex stood the master, a full member of the guild who had demonstrated his competence, paid his fees, and sworn his oaths. Below him came the journeyman, trained craftsmen who had completed their apprenticeships but had not yet achieved master status. At the bottom were the apprentices, young people bound by contract to learn the trade under their master's supervision. This three-tiered structure provided the framework for training that would produce skilled craftsmen for generation after generation. It was not merely an economic arrangement but a system of education, socialization, and moral formation that shaped young people from childhood to adulthood. The journey began with apprenticeship, typically starting when a child was 7 to 12 years old. Parents seeking to place a child as an apprentice would negotiate with a master, agreeing on the terms of the arrangement. The length of apprenticeship varied by trade and location. 7 years was common in England, but terms ranged from as few as 2 to as many as 12 years, depending on the complexity of the craft and local custom. The contract that bound apprentice to master was a serious legal document, witnessed and often registered with guild or municipal authorities. It specified the obligations of both parties. The master agreed to teach the apprentice his trade, to provide food, clothing, and lodging, and often to give a set of tools or a sum of money at the end of the term. The apprentice agreed to serve faithfully, to keep his master's secrets, to avoid taverns and gambling houses, and generally to conduct himself with the seriousness appropriate to one learning a respectable trade. For the young apprentice, entering a master's household meant leaving behind the world of childhood. He, and it was almost always he, for most guilds excluded women from formal apprenticeship, became part of a new family, subject to the authority of his master and mistress, as completely as he had been subject to his parents. He slept under their roof, ate at their table, and was subject to their discipline. Many apprenticeship contracts explicitly gave masters the right to administer physical punishment for misbehavior. The early years of apprenticeship involved little actual craft work. The young apprentice swept floors, ran errands, tended fires, and performed whatever menial tasks the household required. He watched the master and journeyman at work, absorbing the rhythms and techniques of the trade through observation before he was allowed to try them himself. Gradually, he was permitted to assist with simpler tasks, preparing materials, handling tools, performing operations that required more patience than skill. As years passed, the apprentice's responsibilities grew. He learned to perform increasingly complex operations, always under supervision, always subject to correction. The master's role was not merely to demonstrate techniques, but to develop judgment, the ability to recognize good work from bad, to understand why certain methods produce certain results, to anticipate problems before they occurred. This kind of knowledge could not be conveyed through words alone. It required years of practice, of trial and error, of watching and doing and gradually internalizing the accumulated wisdom of the trade. The relationship between master and apprentice was ideally one of mutual benefit and even affection. The master gained an extra pair of hands, a helper who would become increasingly useful as his skills developed. The apprentice gained access to valuable knowledge and the prospect of a respectable livelihood. Many masters treated their apprentices almost as sons, and some apprentices eventually married their masters' daughters and inherited their businesses. Yet, the relationship could also be exploitative. Unscrupulous masters might use apprentices primarily as cheap labor, teaching them little of real value while working them hard. They might feed and clothe them poorly, house them in uncomfortable quarters, and treat them harshly. Apprentices who felt mistreated had limited recourse. They might appeal to guild authorities, who sometimes intervened in cases of clear abuse. But running away meant forfeiting years of service and starting over with nothing. When the term of apprenticeship ended, the young craftsman faced a new phase of life. He was no longer a child dependent on his master, but neither was he yet a full member of the guild. He had entered the intermediate stage of the journeyman, the word itself derived from the French journée, meaning a day's work, reflecting the fact that journeymen were typically paid by the day, rather than receiving the annual wages of servants or the profits of masters. The journeyman years were often years of wandering. Custom and sometimes guild regulation required that newly trained craftsmen travel, working for different masters in different towns, broadening their experience and perfecting their skills. This wanderjahr tradition was particularly strong in the German lands, where journeymen might spend several years on the road, traveling from town to town with their tools on their backs, seeking work wherever they could find it. The wandering journeyman occupied a peculiar social position. He was no longer a dependent youth, but not yet an established householder. He possessed valuable skills, but owned little property. He might work in a master's shop for weeks or months, then move on to the next town, the next opportunity. This mobility made journeymen difficult to control, and guild regulations often reflected anxiety about their behavior, prohibitions on forming their own associations, requirements to register with local authorities, restrictions on how long they could remain in one place. For the journeyman, the goal was always to become a master. This required accumulating the capital needed to establish an independent shop, finding a suitable location, and gaining admission to the guild. The requirements for master status varied, but typically included demonstrating competence through the creation of a masterpiece, a work that proved the candidate's skill in all aspects of the trade. The masterpiece examination was a serious undertaking. The candidate might be required to work under observation, using materials provided by the guild, completing a specified project within a set time. Guild officials would examine the finished work with critical eyes, looking for any flaw or shortcoming that might disqualify the candidate. The standards were often exacting, and failure was not uncommon, especially for candidates without connections or resources. Those who passed the examination and paid the required fees became masters, full members of the guild with all its rights and privileges. They could establish their own shops, take on apprentices, vote in guild meetings, and hold guild offices. They had achieved the goal toward which years of training had been directed: independence, respectability, a secure place in the social order. Yet achieving master status was becoming more difficult as the medieval period progressed. Early guilds had been relatively open, welcoming new members who could demonstrate competence and pay modest fees. Over time, however, established masters sought to limit competition by raising barriers to entry. Fees increased. Masterpiece requirements became more demanding. Sons and sons-in-law of existing masters received preferential treatment, while outsiders faced additional obstacles. By the later Middle Ages, the master class in many trades had become nearly hereditary. A journeyman without family connections might work his entire life without ever achieving master status, remaining permanently in a subordinate position. The guild system, which had originally provided a path for talented individuals to rise through skill and effort, increasingly served to perpetuate existing inequalities. This closing of the guilds created tensions that would simmer for centuries. Journeymen, frustrated by blocked advancement, sometimes formed their own associations, compagnonnages in France, Gesellenverbände in Germany, to protect their interests and provide mutual support. These organizations operated in a gray area, sometimes tolerated by authorities, sometimes suppressed as threats to guild order. They developed their own rituals, their own hierarchies, their own traditions, creating a parallel world within the guild system. The life of a guild member extended far beyond the workshop. The guild was a total institution, claiming its members, loyalty and participation in every aspect of existence. It was a religious brotherhood, a mutual aid society, a social club, and a political organization all at once. The religious dimension of guild life was particularly pronounced. Medieval people did not separate the sacred from the secular as we do today. Work itself was understood as a form of worship, a way of serving God through the exercise of the talents he had bestowed. The guild sanctified this understanding, placing craftwork within a framework of religious meaning and obligation. Each guild had its patron saint, chosen for some connection to the trade, often a saint who had practiced the craft during his or her earthly life, or one whose martyrdom involved tools or materials associated with the trade. Guild members gathered on their patron's feast day for special observances. They maintained altars or chapels dedicated to the saint, paying for candles, vestments, and masses. They processed through the streets on holy days, carrying banners and images, displaying their devotion for all to see. These religious observances reinforced guild solidarity. Members who prayed together, who celebrated together, who mourned together at the funerals of their fellows, developed bonds that transcended mere business relationships. The guild became a spiritual family, united not only by common economic interests, but by shared faith and practice. The charitable functions of guilds expressed this spiritual dimension in practical form. Guild funds supported members who fell ill and could not work. They provided for widows and orphans of deceased members. They gave alms to the poor, maintained hospitals and almshouses, and performed the corporal works of mercy that medieval Christianity enjoined upon all believers. When a guild member died, the guild ensured a proper burial. Fellow members attended the funeral, processing behind the coffin in their guild livery. The guild paid for masses to be said for the deceased soul, speeding its passage through purgatory. The dead member's name was inscribed in the guild's records, to be remembered in prayers for years to come. This care for the dead reflected medieval beliefs about the communion of saints. The living and the dead remained connected, bound together in a community that transcended the grave. The great feasts of the guild calendar provided occasions for celebration and display. The annual feast on the patron saint's day, brought all members together for eating, drinking, and fellowship. These were elaborate affairs, with prescribed courses, ceremonial toasts, and entertainment. Guild ordinances often specified exactly what food should be served, how much wine each member might consume, and what penalties applied to those who became too rowdy. Beyond the annual feast, guilds marked other occasions with communal celebrations. The admission of new masters called for festivities. The election of guild officers required appropriate ceremony. Royal visits, military victories, and other public events prompted processions and displays in which guilds participated as corporate bodies, marching in prescribed order, wearing their distinctive livery, demonstrating their place in the civic hierarchy. The mystery plays represented perhaps the most remarkable cultural achievement of medieval guilds. In towns across England and parts of continental Europe, guilds took responsibility for staging elaborate dramatic presentations of biblical stories. These plays, performed on wagons that moved through the town streets or on fixed stages in public squares, brought scripture to life for audiences who could not read the Bible for themselves. The assignment of plays to particular guilds often reflected the guild's trade in ways both obvious and subtle. The shipwrights of York performed the story of Noah's Ark. The goldsmiths of Coventry staged the visit of the Magi, with their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The bakers of Chester presented the Last Supper. These connections between craft and story reinforced the sense that each trade had its place in the divine order, its role in the great drama of salvation. The production of mystery plays required substantial investment of time, money, and effort. Guilds commissioned scripts, built wagons and scenery, created costumes and props, and rehearsed their members in performance. The plays themselves could be sophisticated works of art, combining religious instruction with comedy, spectacle, and genuine dramatic power. The York Cycle, the Chester Cycle, the Wakefield plays, these represent a remarkable flowering of vernacular drama, made possible by the guild system's capacity for collective action. Guild halls served as the physical centers of this rich social life. A prosperous guild hall was more than a meeting place. It was a symbol of the guild's wealth and standing, a repository of its treasures and records, a venue for its ceremonies and celebrations. The great guild halls of Flanders, with their soaring towers and elaborate facades, proclaimed the power of the merchant and craft associations that built them. Even more modest halls, in smaller towns and less wealthy trades, served as focal points for guild identity and activity. Within the hall, the guild conducted its formal business. Regular meetings brought members together to elect officers, hear reports, adjudicate disputes, and make decisions about guild policy. These meetings followed prescribed forms, with officers seated in order of rank, speeches delivered according to protocol, and votes taken in established ways. The guild's records, its charters, ordinances, membership rolls, and accounts were kept in the hall, often in elaborate chests secured with multiple locks. The hall also housed the guild's treasures, its silver plate, its ceremonial regalia, its banner and livery. These objects embodied the guild's corporate identity and were displayed on appropriate occasions. The guild's seal, used to authenticate documents and mark goods, was kept under careful guard. The loss or misuse of the seal would compromise the guild's authority and reputation. Yet for all its emphasis on community and mutual support, the guild system had its darker aspects. The same mechanisms that protected members and maintained standards could also exclude, restrict, and oppress. Understanding these limitations is essential to grasping the full complexity of medieval guild life. The treatment of women provides a telling example. Most craft guilds explicitly excluded women from membership, reserving the formal structures of training and advancement for men alone. Women might work alongside their husbands in family workshops, and widows sometimes inherited the right to continue their husbands' businesses, but they remained outside the guild's official hierarchy. They could not vote in guild meetings, hold guild offices, or take on apprentices in their own right. This exclusion reflected broader medieval assumptions about gender and work. Certain occupations, spinning, brewing, some aspects of textile production, were considered appropriate for women, and might be organized in separate female guilds or left unregulated entirely. But the prestigious crafts, Those that conferred status and political power remained male preserves. Women's work, however essential to the economy, was systematically devalued and marginalized. The guild system was also exclusionary in other ways. Jews were typically barred from guild membership, confined to occupations like moneylending that Christians were forbidden to practice. In some regions, other groups faced similar restrictions: Moors in Spain, various ethnic minorities elsewhere. The guild's definition of community had clear boundaries, and those outside those boundaries faced significant disadvantages. Even among those eligible for membership, the guild system could perpetuate inequality. As entry requirements grew more demanding and fees more expensive, the gap between masters and journeymen widened. Sons of masters enjoyed preferential treatment, while outsiders faced obstacles that might prove insurmountable. The guild that had once provided a path for advancement increasingly served to entrench existing hierarchies. The guild's control over production could also stifle innovation. Regulations that specified exactly how goods should be made left little room for experimentation. Craftsmen who developed new techniques might find themselves in violation of guild ordinances. The emphasis on tradition and continuity, while it preserved valuable knowledge, could also prevent adaptation to changing circumstances. Relations between different guilds could be contentious. Jurisdictional disputes arose when trades overlapped. Did the making of a particular item belong to the carpenters or the joiners, the weavers or the fullers? These conflicts could drag on for years, consuming resources and generating bitter feelings. Within towns, guilds competed for status and precedence, jealously guarding their place in civic processions and ceremonies. The guild's relationship with political authority was similarly complex. Guilds depended on royal or municipal charters for their legal existence and their monopoly powers. This dependence gave authorities leverage over guild behavior. Kings and town councils might use this leverage to extract revenue, to impose policies guilds opposed, or to favor certain groups over others. The guild's autonomy was always conditional, always subject to the superior power of the state. Conflicts between guilds and authorities erupted periodically throughout the medieval period. Guilds that grew too powerful might find their privileges curtailed. Those that resisted royal policies might face suppression. The balance of power shifted over time, with guilds generally losing ground as centralized states grew stronger in the later Middle Ages and early modern period. Within the guild itself, power was not equally distributed. Wealthy masters dominated guild governance, using their positions to advance their own interests. Poorer masters, journeymen, and apprentices had little voice in decisions that affected their lives. The guild's democratic forms, elections, meetings, votes, often masked oligarchic realities. Those who controlled the guild's resources controlled its policies. These tensions and contradictions did not destroy the guild system, but they shaped its evolution and eventually contributed to its decline. The guild that emerged from the High Middle Ages was not the same institution that had developed in the 11th and 12th centuries. It had become more rigid, more exclusive, more concerned with protecting existing privileges than with fostering opportunity and innovation. The transformation of the guild system accelerated in the centuries following the medieval period. The 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries brought changes that would eventually render the traditional guild obsolete, though the process was gradual and uneven, varying enormously from place to place. The expansion of European trade, in the age of exploration, created new economic realities that strained guild structures. Goods from Asia, Africa, and the Americas flooded European markets, disrupting established patterns of production and consumption. New industries arose that had no place in the traditional guild framework: printing, sugar refining, the manufacture of goods for colonial markets. Entrepreneurs seeking to exploit these opportunities chafed at guild restrictions that limited their freedom of action. The rise of putting-out systems and proto-industrial production further undermined guild control. Merchants discovered that they could bypass urban guilds by organizing production in the countryside, where guild regulations did not apply. Rural workers desperate for income would spin thread, weave cloth, or perform other tasks for piece rates far below what urban craftsmen demanded. The finished goods might be brought to town for final processing and sale, but the bulk of production occurred outside guild jurisdiction. The centralization of political power in emerging nation-states posed another challenge. Medieval guilds had operated within a fragmented political landscape, negotiating with local lords, town councils, and regional authorities. The consolidation of royal power reduced this fragmentation, creating larger political units with more uniform policies. Monarchs seeking to promote economic development often viewed guilds as obstacles, their monopolies and restrictions impeding the free flow of commerce. The intellectual climate was changing as well. The economic thought that would eventually crystallize into classical liberalism began to emerge, challenging the assumptions that underlay guild organization. Thinkers questioned whether monopolies and restrictions truly served the public good. They argued that competition, not regulation, produced the best outcomes for consumers and society. These ideas gained influence gradually, shaping policy in some areas while leaving others untouched. French Revolution marked a decisive turning point in the history of European guilds. The revolutionary government, committed to principles of individual liberty and free enterprise, abolished the guilds in 1791. The Le Chapelier law prohibited not only guilds but any association of workers or employers that might restrict economic freedom. This radical break with centuries of tradition would be imitated, with variations, across much of Europe in the following decades. The Industrial Revolution delivered the final blow to whatever remained of the guild system. The factory, with its division of labor and its powered machinery, rendered traditional craft production obsolete in one industry after another. The skilled craftsman who had spent years mastering his trade found himself competing with machines that could produce goods faster, cheaper, and in greater quantities. The intimate workshop gave way to the vast factory floor. The master-journeyman apprentice hierarchy gave way to the employer-employee relationship of industrial capitalism. Yet the passing of the guilds did not mean the disappearance of everything they had represented. The human needs that guilds had served for training, for quality assurance, for professional identity, for mutual support, did not vanish simply because the institutional forms that had addressed them were abolished. New institutions arose to fill the void, often drawing on guild precedents even as they adapted to new circumstances. The trade unions that emerged in the 19th century inherited something of the guild spirit, even as they operated in a very different economic context. Like guilds, unions sought to protect workers' interests through collective action. Like guilds, they developed rituals, symbols, and traditions that reinforced solidarity. Like guilds, they provided mutual aid to members in distress. The language of brotherhood, of craft pride, of fair dealing, all this echoed guild values, translated into industrial idiom. Professional associations for doctors, lawyers, architects, and other learned occupations preserved guild-like functions in new forms. They controlled entry into the profession through examinations and licensing. They established ethical standards and disciplined members who violated them. They maintained the profession's reputation and advocated for its interests. The medieval guild would have recognized these functions, even if the specific practices differed. The apprenticeship system, though transformed, never entirely disappeared. Modern vocational training programs, from German dual education to American trade schools, continue the tradition of learning through doing, of acquiring skill through supervised practice. The master craftsman may now be called a mentor or supervisor, the apprentice a trainee or intern, but the underlying relationship experienced practitioner, guiding novice through the mysteries of the trade, remains recognizable. The guild's emphasis on quality and standards lives on in modern certification and accreditation systems. When we see a product bearing a seal of approval, when we verify that a professional holds appropriate credentials, when we trust that goods meet established standards, we are relying on mechanisms that guilds pioneered. The guild's insight that quality requires collective enforcement, that individual reputation depends on group reputation, remains valid even in our very different economic world. Even the Guildhall has its modern descendants. The headquarters of professional associations, the meeting places of trade organizations, the union halls where workers gather, these serve functions analogous to those medieval buildings where guild members conducted their business and celebrated their fellowship. The human need for physical spaces that embody collective identity has not disappeared. The legacy of medieval guilds extends beyond these institutional echoes. The guild system shaped European cities in ways that remain visible today. The street patterns, the building types, the neighborhood identities that guilds created have proven remarkably durable. A visitor to Bruges or York or Florence walks streets that guilds helped to shape, passes buildings that guilds constructed, encounters names and symbols that guilds established. The artistic heritage of the guilds is equally enduring. The masterpieces that craftsmen created to demonstrate their skill, the decorative objects that guild wealth commissioned, the churches and chapels that guild piety endowed, these constitute a significant portion of the medieval artistic legacy. The anonymous craftsmen who carved cathedral portals, who illuminated manuscripts, who forged ironwork of astonishing intricacy, were products of the guild system, trained in its workshops, shaped by its values. The guild system also contributed to the development of ideas about work and its place in human life. The medieval craftsman understood his labor as something more than a mere means of earning a living. It was a calling, a vocation, a way of serving God and community through the exercise of skill. This understanding of work as meaningful, as dignified, as worthy of respect, represents a significant contribution to Western thought about labor and its value. The guild's vision of economic life as embedded in social relationships, rather than as a separate sphere governed by its own laws, offers a counterpoint to modern economic thinking. The guild assumed that economic activity should serve human flourishing, not the reverse. It took for granted that markets required regulation, that competition needed limits, that the pursuit of profit must be balanced against other values. These assumptions, so foreign to classical economic liberalism, have found new relevance in contemporary debates about the limits of market society. And so we return to where we began, to that medieval town in the hour before sunrise, where the sounds of craftwork are rising from 100 workshops, where painted signs swing in the morning breeze, where the guild system orders and shapes every aspect of urban life. That world is gone now, swept away by revolutions economic, political, and intellectual. The guilds that seemed so permanent, so essential, so woven into the fabric of society, proved in the end to be historical creations, products of particular circumstances that would not last forever. Yet something of what they represented endures. The human beings who created and sustained the guild system were grappling with challenges that remain recognizable: how to train young people for productive work, how to maintain quality in the goods we produce, how to balance individual ambition with collective welfare, how to create communities that provide meaning and belonging as well as material security. Their answers were shaped by their times, limited by their assumptions, flawed in ways we can now see clearly. But they were serious answers to serious questions, and they served their purposes for half a millennium. The guild member who rose before dawn to begin his day's work, who took pride in his craft and his place in the guild hierarchy, who attended mass with his fellows and feasted with them on holy days, who knew that his guild would care for him in sickness and bury him in death. This person inhabited a world very different from our own, yet he was not so different from us in his fundamental needs and aspirations. He wanted security and dignity, community and meaning, the satisfaction of work well done, and the respect of his peers. The guild system, for all its limitations, provided a framework within which these needs could be met. As the centuries have passed and the guild system has faded into history, we have found other ways to address these needs, other institutions and arrangements that serve analogous purposes. Whether our solutions are better or worse than those of our medieval predecessors is a question that admits no simple answer. We have gained freedoms they could not imagine, but we have also lost solidarities they took for granted. We have created wealth beyond their dreams, but we have also created alienations they never knew. The whispered ages carry many lessons, and among them is this: that human beings have always sought to organize their economic lives in ways that serve not only material needs, but social and spiritual ones as well. The medieval guild was one such attempt, imperfect but earnest, limited but meaningful. Its time has passed, but its story remains worth telling, worth pondering, worth remembering, as we continue our own efforts to build economic institutions worthy of human beings. In the end, the guild's greatest legacy may be simply the reminder that such efforts are possible, that the economy is not a force of nature beyond human control, but a human creation that can be shaped to human purposes. That reminder, whispered across the ages, still has the power to inspire.